Well, I admit I didn't see it coming, but I'm not supposed to see it coming. It's a stealth bomber. Hi, everybody. I'm Bill Whittle here with Steve Green and Scott Ott, and this is your right angle on the B-21 bomber, which, as you know, I'm a big fan of military hardware and have been for quite a long time. And, you know, full disclosure, I'm embarrassed to say, quite surprised actually to say, that I had not even heard of the B-21 until just a little bit earlier today. But the reason I heard about it earlier today is because I have been a vocal critic of both the F-35 program in terms of its procurement. It's a $1 trillion program. And also I've been a pretty vocal critic of the jet. This would also be a good opportunity for me to demonstrate the fact that little knowledge is a dangerous thing, and that makes me a heavily armed individual. The initial criticisms I had of the F-35 program, which my criticisms about how it was paid for and how much it cost stand. But the idea that the jet is junk was a result of an F-16 beating the F-35 in a dogfight a couple years ago, significantly outperforming it. And what I hadn't realized until I talked to some of my fighter pilot friends was that, number one, the weapons that the F-35 can be deployed at any angle. It doesn't need to get in a dogfight. It can be flying away from a jet and put a missile out there and kill it. But much more importantly than the technology, what we're finding is that the Air Force pilots who were in the F-35 simply didn't realize what the jet was capable of. They simply didn't realize what that jet was capable of. So it's a chance for me to apologize a little bit on behalf of the F-35 performance anyway. But Steve, let's start with you. We have a very high likelihood that this will be the last manned bomber built by the United States. It's expected to enter service in the mid-2020s, I believe, somewhere in there.
Yeah, 2025. I wouldn't be surprised if it ended up being a little late, though. It's Pentagon.
A little bit late. And is apparently, I got this from you before our show, and our backstage show, is expected to last into the 2080s or something along those lines. Yeah. Right now, the workhorse of heavy bombing, if we really want to put a bunch of iron on a target, is the B-52. And there are people who are flying B-52s today whose grandparents flew the B-52.
Yeah.
That jet's been in service for 65 years, something like that, and is expected to stretch another 10 or 15.
Oh, longer than that.
Yeah.
Believe it or not,
so upgrades in some planes are just well designed. What do you think about the B-21? It's actually, to the untrained eye, it is virtually identical to the B-2. It is cleaner. There's not quite as many little inlets and outlets and so on, so it should be even stealthier. I guess my question for you, Steve, is if this is going to be the mainstay of our bombing, Air Force bombers' capabilities for the next 60, 70, 80 years, do you think we will be willing to deploy them? Because there's been a fair amount of discussion about whether or not the B-2 should be deployed in active combat situations simply because of its cost and the fact that we have so few of them.
Yeah, well, you know, the original plan for the B-2 Spirit, which, by the way, B-21 Raider is a much better name. Spirit is just a lousy name for a bomber, even though it's a magnificent machine. Just not a good name. The B-2, we were originally supposed to build 80 or 100 of those, and instead we built, I think, 22, and we lost one in an accident in Guam a couple of years ago. So we've got, it's a tiny fleet. And there comes a point where can you afford to lose one? And so instead we're sending 5th generation heavy bombers against Huts in Afghanistan. And it's a little bit silly. The plan now is to build a minimum of 80 to 100 of the B-21 Raiders and perhaps as many as 200. I hope we live in a world where we don't need that many heavy bombers, but I'm not going to, I wouldn't pin my hopes on that too much. That said, what you have to imagine is taking the lessons we've learned from the B-2, the F-22, and the F-35. One of the reasons the F-35 performed so well at the Red Flag exercise at Nellis is its battlefield eyesight. It gives every pilot the view of God, and he can share that view with every other plane. They had guys in F-35s at this Red Flag exercise who were out of pretend missiles. They couldn't fire anymore. But the guys in F-22s wanted them to stay in the battle because the F-22 Raptor
sensor platform.
Yes, got a better view of the battlefield from the F-35 flying next to them than they did from their own sensor suite. It's amazing. So if you take the heavy lift and stealth ability of the B-2 and combine it with the God's eye view of the F-35, you're talking about a remarkable bomber. And if that isn't the future of our bomber fleet, it had better be, because the B-1, the B-2, and the B-52 are all scheduled to start retiring in the mid-2030s and finish retiring by 2050. That doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're talking about trying to build 200 bombers at a build rate of maybe 10 a year, we got to get cracking on this.
Yeah. Well said and extremely informative.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome. Scott, the entire purpose of the B-2 is to penetrate enemy radar defenses and so on. There's some talk about how some modern radars render stealth completely useless or so on. I'm not even going to get into that discussion with you. But what does interest me is this. This is likely to be, as I said earlier, I think the last manned bomber built by the United States Air Force. Do you think it's important to have a human being sitting in the cockpit of a vehicle that's being sent over to drop almost certainly going to be conventional weapons, but certainly the aircraft is designed to deliver nuclear weapons? Do you feel like that is something that we should have an automated pilot on?
Well, let me get to that in a second. First of all, I'm encouraged that the B-20 that Bill hadn't heard about the B-21, because maybe somebody is observing OPSEC. I mean, maybe we're actually not just.
I'm sorry, I became momentarily confused and disoriented. Yes, that's a possibility.
Yeah,
Imagine
that would be great if somebody in the government was actually not blabbing about every single thing we're doing all the time. So that's encouraging to me. As far as the B-52s go, I didn't even know those were still in use. The last thing I heard was Planet Claire and Rock Lobster, and I have not heard anything from them since then. So,
not even in your own private Idaho?
No, I had not. But actually, I'm reading, our members are tired of hearing now, I'm getting through finally the third volume of Winston Churchill's biography by William Manchester and Paul Reed, and the unbelievable losses of flight crews involved in the British bombing of German cities when the Germans were conducting the Blitz against London and bombing everything in England, and British had only really the only retaliatory efforts they could muster. They couldn't put an army on land. They were getting wiped out by U-boats in the Atlantic and in the English Channel and elsewhere. The only thing they could really muster was RAF bombers flying over German cities. But it was incredible. They could make planes faster than they could make crews. It is easy to make a plane. It's expensive to make a pilot. And so I guess, in a sense, I don't mind that the planes are being flown by a guy who's sitting in Kansas somewhere staring at a few monitors. That may not necessarily be a bad thing. I have one personal encounter with a stealth. In this case, it was a stealth fighter. I went to the Willow Grove Air Show years ago with my brother Jim, who's a pilot for United Airlines, flew an A-10 Warthog tank killer jet, flew some helicopters for the Army. And they had the big thing at the air show was that they had this stealth fighter, and everybody was all excited. So, people kind of mill around at air shows and pay attention to some things and don't pay attention to other things. But in this case, everybody was lined up. Everybody's up against the fence, and they wanted to see this flyby of this stealth fighter. And this thing finally comes by, and the announcer's talking over the PA system, and here she comes and everything like this. And this thing made the most horrendous noise of anything I've ever heard. And I turned to my little brother, who's taller than me and smarter and better in every other way, and I looked at him and I said, I thought that this thing was supposed to be a stealth fighter. That's the worst noise I've ever heard coming out of any machine in my life. And he said, well, the enemy never hears that. And I think to a certain extent, it made me sleep more soundly knowing that we have such technology. And these expensive fighters and these expensive bombers that we never want to use become more expensive if you only make 22 of them. It's the development cost that really runs up the cost. When we say, oh, well, the fighter costs $35 million a piece. Well, not if you make 200 of them.
Well said. A couple things just to respond to there. There is a sound that a high-performance jet makes. You can certainly hear it on F-15s and F-16s, F-22s and F-35s especially. And that is the sound of at an air show of an American fighter jet in a high G turn. And you can literally hear the air being ripped apart. It's not just the sound of the motors.
Yeah.
You can hear it's like a tearing of canvas. It's the sound of this jet just tearing the air apart. That's what freedom sounds like. And I know that sounds like a chauvinistic Neanderthal knuckle-dragging thing to say, but it's actually not.
Yeah.
People look at what the cost of this program will be, along with the cost of the F-35 and so on and so on and so on. And you ask yourself, well, what could we have bought with the $1 trillion that we spent on the F-35? But that's not really the question. The question really is, what about the $71 trillion of private property and just things in America? Those things are protected by our expenditure on defense. And the reason I was pleased to see the B-21 program as far along as it was, and I'm also very pleased that they actually seem to be watching the budget, but technically that's not really the issue. The issue is pretty simply this: are we going ahead or are we going behind? There is no standing still. The Chinese and the Russians managed to copy a fair amount of our stealth technology. Are their jets any good? I don't think they're as good as they think they are. There's a lot to be said about an airplane that has a operational history and certainly the crews that can flight them. But we're either moving ahead or we're moving backwards. My father told me this when the American civilian SST was canceled. He was very upset by it. Senate canceled it. The Boeing 7700, I think it was. And he said, you're either going forward or you're going backwards. Our enemies are going forward. We need to be going forward as well. We make the best stuff in the world. We have the best crews in the world. We have the best operational capacity in the world. We have the best logistics in the world. We need to keep it that way. I'll just close by saying something that was reminded to me by Scott's remarks about Winston Churchill, who as a young man was part of the last cavalry charge in the British Empire. Yeah. He was the first Lord of the Admiralty during World War I, and briefly First Lord during World War II before becoming Prime Minister. Winston Churchill's life chronicled the fall of the British Empire despite his best efforts, and their finest hour was in fact pretty nearly their final hour. The reason that Great Britain is no longer the power that it used to be is, I think, extremely simple, can be put in one very simple idea. For the years that Great Britain was the predominant power in the world, it was the policy of the British government, and this was very simple policy. We will spend whatever we have to spend so that the Royal Navy is capable of defeating the second and third largest navies in the world combined. And we will continue to spend that money for as long as it takes. An island nation with the best navy in the world made a commitment to spend what was necessary to defeat an alliance of the second and third biggest navies in the world. And that commitment is what kept the British Empire and safe. If we lose that commitment to continuing that sense of, yes, defense is expensive, but not defense is a lot more expensive, then we're in trouble. So I'm heartened by things like that. I'm heartened by things like the SR-72. I never thought I'd see anything better than the SR-71. SR-72 appears to be unmanned. I don't know how real it is, but the fact that we're going faster and higher is good. This is actual progress, progressives. This is not the idea of progress yes. being sitting around in a bunch of mud huts, picking insects off each other and burning our sustainable cow patties and, trying to raise money in a bake sale of our granola for the Guatemalan water snake. That's not progress. This is progress. And I'm happy to be able to make a report like this. That'll do it for your right angle for today. It's all made possible by a very small number of people who have had the generosity and the vision to pay to make these programs possible. If you've been enjoying this program and you're not one of those people, you can go to BillWhittle.com and become a member. We certainly would love your help, and we need it. Do. That'll do it. We'll see you next week on Right Angle. Thanks for everybody. I'm Bill Whittle, and we'll see you next time.
This State Department is being decapitated and depleted at a dizzying speed. That's the headline from the Washington Post. Hi, I'm Scott Ott with Bill Whittle and Stephen Green. This episode of Right Angles brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. Well, a Washington Post columnist named Joe Davidson quotes Barbara Stevenson, who is the American Foreign Service president, kind of the, union boss, I guess you would say it that way, although technically probably not a union. And she says this, and I quote from the Washington Post, "The ranks of career ministers, our three-star equivalents, are down from 33 in June of 2016 to 19. The ranks of our two-star minister counselors have fallen from 431 right after Labor Day to 369 today, and they're still falling." The Post says at the entry level, or the columnist in the Post anyway, says at the entry level, Stevenson expects about 100 new Foreign Service officers to join the State Department next year, compared with 366 in 2016. Here's a quote from Stevenson. She says, "These numbers are hard to square with the stated agenda of making the State Department and the Foreign Service stronger," she said, calling the cuts a decapitation to its leadership ranks. Now, Stephen Green, if you are going to do what President Trump says we're going to do and have a robust foreign policy and foster respect for American exceptionalism around the world, how can you do so without a robust State Department?
Well, there are two parts to that question, and the first is State Department is about as useless as blank on a snake. All right, we know
legs.
this. Legs. Thank you. Clean that up for me. Listen, we have needed an imaginative State Department since approximately noon on September 11, 2001, and that's a long time ago now. All right, 16 years ago now. And instead, we still have the same stale people from the same stale schools taught by the same stale people. And we do not have the State Department that this country needs in a world that is fast-moving, fast-changing, and extremely, in parts of it anyway, increasingly dangerous. The nice safe parts are still the nice safe parts, but the Georgetown crowd doesn't seem to understand that approach that works in Berlin, Brussels, or even Beijing does not work in Raqqa or Tehran. So, number one. Number two is we could use a much smaller State Department. That's fine. Corporations shed white-collar workers like crazy starting in the early 90s with real computerization, and they're stronger for it, not weaker, stronger. The problem in state isn't that there are all these empty desks. We could use more empty desks. The problem is we've got too many Obama holdovers, and you want to talk about the drabbest, most stale thinkers around. 8 years of that stuff, and they're still entrenched. If Rex Tillerson wants to have a meaningful tenure at state, it's not that he has to hire a bunch of new people, it's that he's got to fire those Obama holdovers, and I don't understand what's taken him so long.
Well, the State Department data indicates that there are 13,873 Foreign Service employees today compared to 13,980 in 2016. So, Bill Whittle, the U.S. Foreign Service is down to its last 13,873 employees. I thought President Trump wanted to make America great again.
This woman writes about all this stuff like it's a bad thing. I don't really know what I can say that didn't get covered by Steve. Obviously, a State Department needs a certain amount of personnel. I suspect 13,000 is a little high. The fact that a career bureaucrat in the federal government is lamenting the fact that fewer bureaucrats are coming into the federal government is, to me, welcome news and terrific. I suspect, and this is the part I think is actually a little interesting, I suspect that what's happening to state is a mirror of what happened to defense under Obama, and likewise, the current situation at defense is somewhat similar to what state was under Obama. People were forced out of the military during the Obama presidency. They weren't just cashiered. A few of them were simply just cashiered. But basically what they did was they tried everything they could to make it intolerable for an honorable warfighter to remain in the Defense Department, either as a serving soldier in the field or as any kind of upper-level officer. They made it so antithetical to what they were trained to do and what they believe their mission is, that the best soldiers we had just left, and they haven't come back. If that is what's happening at state, then that's nothing but good news, because the people who are leaving and the people who would normally come in and are not coming in are the people that have allowed North Korea 8 years of nuclear development. They're the people that put $800 million on a pallet and flew it to the Iranians for them to use to develop their nuclear weapons. This is the same State Department that basically lost the Wan War in Iraq. Same State Department that's done all of these horrible things. It's just useless, worthless diplomats of a philosophy, as you said, of a philosophy that is just simply so outdated. It's not 8 years old. I almost said it was 100 years old going back to the progressive movement, but essentially it's timeless. This belief that if we're nice to people who are enemies, who live in dominance-based societies, this belief that if we're nice to bullies and tyrants undoubtedly goes back to Babylon. It just has to. And to get rid of people like that is actually not only good for American diplomacy, it's also making all of us safer. Because look, I would rather have a situation that's handled by state rather than by defense in terms of if there's a pressing crisis. If we can keep it to diplomatic terms, that's better for everybody. But the Department of State and the Department of Defense both need to be going in the same direction, and that is looking out for the vital interests of the United States against implacable enemies who will not ever surrender their cause of destroying freedom. So if you want to get rid of all the people that don't believe in this pretty simple stuff, then I think I think it's a blessing. Goodbye, good riddance, and take your attitude with you.
You know, you're in a bad situation during the Obama administration when the Secretary of State was not even as smart as Gollum. I mean, at least Gollum understood we be nice to them if they be nice to us.
I will say that the former Secretary of State wasn't as lifelike or realistic looking as Gollum.
It's amazing things they can do with CGI these days. Well, there's a Title 22 in the U.S. Code, Section 2651, under the topic of foreign relations and intercourse, Chapter 38, and it says this: Establishment of Department of State. There shall be at the seat of government an executive department to be known as the Department of State, and a Secretary of State who shall be the head thereof. And that's it. And frankly, when it comes to staffing, I think that's fine right there. I mean, there's a Secretary of State. Yeah. What else do you need? And in fact, I can't remember the exact number, but I know the number was less than 4 in the State Department when Thomas Jefferson was Secretary of State. Now, there were only 13 states back then, and now there are like 4 times that many. So if he needs to have 16 staff members at the State Department, that's fine with me too. You just know the disease that's going on at the State Department and elsewhere in the federal government when you read a quote like this. And this was also from that same Washington Post story. Reflecting declining spirits at state, one longtime Foreign Service officer decided to quit because she no longer feels appreciated, let alone indispensable. She's indispensable. It's not over yet. Oh. She's still on the payroll, so she spoke to not be anonymously, to not be identified. So she's not feeling appreciated. She's not feeling indispensable anymore, but she will cash the check. And I think that there are too many rent-seeking bureaucrats in the organization already. And in all seriousness, 13,873 staff people to represent the United States around the world. You would think among 13,873, or actually 890-something during the Obama administration, there would be maybe one of them who spoke Russian well enough to spell it reset correctly on a button. Is it possible? Yeah, I measure the results, not the input. If you say, well, to have a strong foreign policy, we need to have 14,000 State Department employees. No. To have a strong foreign policy, we need to have peace because our enemies fear us and our allies respect us. And I don't care if that takes 4 people like it did under Thomas Jefferson's leadership or 14,000 people, but I suspect it's a number closer to 4 than to 14,000. For Bill Whittle, Stephen Green, and the entire Right Angle team, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making this possible.
Okay, so some really, really weird stuff appears to be going on YouTube, I guess now and in the past, which is all especially egregious to those non-leftists who have had their channels demonetized, targeted, delisted, banned, shut down, suspended, and so on, while YouTube has been investing an enormous amount of resources playing whack-a-mole with Michelle Malkin videos critical of Islam. They have been also trying to demonetize, delegitimize, and delist non-leftist vloggers, and it has been catastrophic for a lot of people on the right, how this has gone down. So they clearly have the incentive and the intention to police their own site. It just seems like they've really been focused on non-leftist political content rather than, say, pedophilia. So there are a number of ways in which this is emerging. One, of course, is that there are these cruelty to children videos that are occurring, where children are being tied up. It's simulated, I hope it's simulated torture and so on, highly sexualized situations, creepy, don't leave the kids alone with that distant third cousin kind of stuff that's going on. Hard to police, right? Hundreds of hours of video footage uploaded to YouTube every day. It is tough to monitor, but there have apparently been hundreds, if not thousands, of channels that have been implicated in this. And this is not stuff with just a few views. This is stuff with tens and tens of millions of views. So stuff that's way up there in terms of visibility. Very, very creepy stuff. Clearly, I would argue, designed to appeal to the creeps who find children sexually attractive. So there's that. There's also, in the comments section, underneath videos uploaded by children a lot of times, there is, contact me with phone numbers, with emails, and urgings for the children to do sexual stuff. That is far easier to find because it's text-based. I used to be a database programmer. I know how to look for text. This kind of stuff is there. And listen, parents, why is your child on YouTube? Like, why is your child on YouTube? This should be highly monitored. Please don't let them have comments. I mean, who knows what creeps are out there trying to find them. I can understand it, if you're Justin Bieber and you're singing away and so on, if it's part of your career or something that you need to do that way, I can kind of understand it. But parents, don't let your kids have YouTube channels. Certainly monitor if you do. If there's some dire necessity, then monitor everything. Don't allow for comments. There's a lot of creepy stuff going on. And I'm telling you, it would not be hard. I've already had like a dozen ideas on how to figure this stuff out. So there's that aspect as well. So there's the creepy videos, big money items, big ad items, lots of money being made from these creepy videos. There are the videos also that have children's characters in them, but of course are not made by the studios who actually own the characters. What happens is you have some children's character that then ends up going on some hyper-sexualized narrative journey. They get the teeth pulled out, there's simulated pregnancies and abortions, there's just really nasty stuff. And a lot of this stuff, of course, goes under the radar of the YouTube children's app, and therefore it's really, it ends up inflicting itself on your kids because, they're watching some suggestive video comes up, and then 2 videos down, they find one of these horrible videos. Now, YouTube, of course, is leaping into action, is starting to deal with all of this stuff, but I've read stuff online. I've read stuff online where activists and people concerned with children's welfare claim that they have been attempting, striving, working hard to bring this information to the attention of YouTube for at least 4 years. 4 years! YouTube has been ignoring or downplaying or bypassing. If these people are telling the truth, they have been ignoring calls to police pedophilic style content on their platform. But then when advertisers are threatening to pull out, and some of them have pulled out because people are saying, look, here's this creepy video of children being tied up, bound in duct tape, horrible things. And, this particular ad is playing in front of it. And, of course, the advertisers are appalled at all of this. So there's all of this going on. Some of it, you could say, well, it's kind of tough to police. Other parts of it, particularly the comments, no. No, not that tough to police. Not that tough to police. I've also heard that sometimes some people say that the flagging system is not working very well or as well as it should, and it is horrendous stuff. But what came up today, which is why I'm talking about this right now, what came up today is something of an entirely different character completely. So, if you go onto YouTube and you're not signed in, right? Not signed in. And you type in the phrase, how to have S. It's appalling what comes up. So I'll go from the bottom, right? How to have S. It's how to have straight hair, how to have soft hair, how to have self-confidence, how to have sexier body, how to have superpowers, how to have swag, how to have SE, and then with S asterisk X, how to have sex in school. Number 3. Number 2, how to have sex kids. And number 1, on the YouTube search algorithm, how to have sex with your kids. Number 1. YouTube, what the fuck is going on over there? What are you people doing? You have time and a half to go and hound political content you find objectionable, to demonetize, to delist, to delegitimize those channels, to destroy people's hard-won intellectual labor and build-up of their channels and their audiences. You have time for all of that. You don't have time to review or fix this? Are you saying nobody has brought this to your attention before? Is it only when something comes out of the mainstream media that this matters to you, that you care about this at all? It's horrible. This is absolutely horrible, horrible stuff. There is lots of people talking about this on Twitter. You don't even have to have how to have S. If you put in, this is on a YouTube search, and if you type in how to have, the number 1 item that is auto-suggested, how to have sex with your kids. Number 1, how to have, not even with the S, how to have. That is absolutely appalling. That is absolutely appalling. This is on a browser, how to have sex with your kids, how to have sex kids, how to have your first kiss, a lucid dream, clear skin. I mean, come on. This cannot be something that is coming out of nowhere. How to have. And someone has done it where they've just done how to have, as in how to HAV. They haven't even done the E. And the number 1 result is how to have sex with your kids, how to have sex kids. I'm appalled. Is this something that is completely unknown to anyone? Has no one ever complained about this before? Is there no capacity to have figured this out in the past? Has no one complained? No one said, oh my God, I don't even know what to say. What the fuck is going on over there? The swamp, let's just say, the swamp is kind of deeper, kind of wider, and frankly, I think a lot closer than any of us ever suspected. So please, let YouTube know about this. We need some answers coming out of this group. How is it that you had months and months and untold amounts of labor to police, harass, demonetize, delegitimize, shut down conservative speakers, right-wing speakers, but not to have a look at this pedophile nest deep in the heart of YouTube that seems to have its tentacles just about everywhere? Please let them know. Get it done. And let's find out. So in my 20s, I had this girlfriend, and I believed the best of her because I was a naive and good-hearted young man who had been raised by a single mother and therefore had not been taught about any of the more challenging or darker aspects of female nature. This is one of the things that's true about single moms as a whole, is because they tend to be low quality. They tend to not be able to help their children avoid low-quality women for obvious reasons. So I had this girlfriend, And she had two complaints in general. Number one was I didn't listen to her. And so I would put on my attentive and listen and so on. And sometimes when I would listen to her, I would, disagree with her. It turns out that's kind of what she meant. That it wasn't that I wasn't listening to her. It's that I was listening to her, but sometimes disagreeing with her. So listening meant to agree. In other words, to self-erase, to be a bland, balding mirror for her own preening vanity. And that was not a good thing. Now, the other thing she used to complain about is she listened to me on the phone with my male friends. And like a lot of guys, we were talking about the world, philosophy, ideas, economics, politics, and so on. And she used to, not eavesdrop, but, sort of be in the place when I was on the phone. And she'd complain to me afterwards. It's like, well, why don't you ever talk about your feelings? Why don't you ever talk about, what's going on in their lives, how their marriage is, and so on, right? And I realized afterwards, and I tried a little bit of this, but it didn't really feel right. And, with my male friends, if we have important emotional stuff to talk about, we'll talk about it. But there seems to be more important work to do in the world today rather than forever gazing up your own navel at your own feelings, at least for me. But I realized that she wanted to make, and I'm not saying this was conscious, but she wanted to make my conversations with my male friends awkward by saying, well, you need to talk about your feelings, otherwise it's not a real conversation. It's like, no, that's what you do with your female friends, and that's totally fine. But it's not what we're doing. Now, it turns out, right, so she was a little bit on the unstable side, and this sort of came out after a while, right? So there's this female chameleon thing where women are what you want up front, and then slowly the mask begins to slip over time. And she wanted me to not be close to my male friends so that they couldn't give me any feedback on her behavior, right? So this is a way of blocking male friendships. And you see this happen all the time, right? Male friendships, it's a bromance, it's semi-gay, it's mocked, it's, because when men band together, they are much stronger and they can pass along masculine wisdom to each other, which is to the detriment of, less stable members of the fairer sex and so on. And so I thought that she was interested in making me a better person. Kind of turns out that she was only interested in controlling me. Now, these thoughts came up to me recently when I was reading about, I know it sounds like a stretch, but it'll make sense. When I was reading about the open-air slave markets in Libya. So the migrants who are swarming up from sub-Saharan Africa trying to get to the welfare state paradise of Europe, passed through Libya. Libya, of course, was destroyed by Hillary Clinton's State Department and Barack Obama's presidency, wherein they basically oversaw the overthrow and murder of Muammar Gaddafi, who said to them, if you destroy me, if you destroy the government of Libya, there will be free passage and open roads from Africa to Europe. I am blocking the migrants who want to get to Europe. But they went ahead and did it anyway. And now, what has been foretold by the late Gaddafi has come to pass. But one of the more horrifying things, and this happened actually earlier this year, one of the more horrifying things that is occurring is these open-air slave markets, wherein the blacks, and the darker the skin, the more racism there is against these blacks, even among their fellow Muslims, but the blacks from sub-Saharan Africa who are trying to get to Europe, and other places, not just sub-Saharan Africa, they are supposed to pay these human smugglers, these human traffickers, but if they can't pay, or if for some other reason, they end up being sold into slavery. And you can, if you have no ethics, you can go to Libya and you can pick up a black slave for about $400 US, give or take, depending on, health and strength and youth and so on. And they're being sold as, good, strong men to work on your farm and so on. And I suppose I still have a certain amount of Scarlet Pimpernel, My Little Pony optimism to scrape from my soul. Because much like when the feminists refused to condemn Bill Clinton for his using of the 22-year-old Monica Lewinsky as his personal cleanup Kleenex after masturbating into her mouth, I guess I was still a little surprised that when a slave trade in blacks is going on in Africa, that's documented, that's filmed, and you can look for it and have a look for the videos, that liberal, leftist, particularly black organizations would be absolutely outraged, would be crying this out to the very heavens. Why? Because, of course, I have been raised, as I'm sure you have been raised, particularly if you're white. I was raised with the argument that slavery, you see, is the very, very worst thing. It's the very, very worst thing in the world. It's so terrible that even 150 years after it ends, you still owe reparations, you still owe jobs, you still owe welfare, you still owe preferential treatment. That's a century and a half. That is how horrendous it is. When 800,000 people in the popular narrative died in the Civil War to free the slaves, mostly whites died, it's not even remotely enough. And slavery, of course, then being the very worst conceivable thing in the world, I guess when I first heard about this, I was waiting for everyone on the left, and of course people on the right too, and all people of good mind, good heart, and good conscience, to rail against the reemergence of this barbaric pre-medieval practice emerging. And I was sitting there waiting, and I would check every now and then, and nothing. And the UN, of course, is upset, and naturally, because it's the UN, they blame the Europeans. It's kind of becoming boringly inevitable at this point. And that's when you escape an abusive relationship, is when it's so predictable that there's no surprise or shock or ownership, moral ownership of the abuse. But there's really been precious little that has been said by a wide variety of organizations that claim to really be into human rights. And the question is, why? Why is there not this massive outrage among black groups, among leftist groups, among liberal groups, among everyone who cares? I've seen this show up on right-wing websites, I've seen this show up on neutral websites, and a few leftist websites, but it's not really gathered any popular momentum. This should be a massive story, the reemergence of slaves in Africa, the reemergence of black slavery. Now, I know it is just popping up. There's indications that there are tens of millions of slaves around the world. But this is one, it's documented, it's local, it's specific, and it has emerged as a result of Democrat policies of destroying Libya as it stood. So why? Now, I guess I began to sort of think about this in a way that is, to me, both liberating and enraging. The truth will set you free, but first of all, it's really going to piss you off. And the way I sort of formulate it in my mind, and let me know what you think in the comments below. I'm always curious to get the hive mind feedback. And the way that I view it is two things. Number one, it's Muslims who are running the slave trade in Libya. So, because it's not white people owning slaves, like far more slaves went to Brazil than went to America, but there's not that same thing because it wasn't always whites who were owning and so on. And again, in America, 3 or 4% of whites actually owned slaves. It was a very upper class thing. I mean, a slave cost as much as a good car these days. So because it's Muslims who are owning and running the slave trade in Libya, I guess it doesn't fit any particular kind of narrative. And the second thing is that I really hesitated on this for a while, but I can't think of any other way to describe it. The reason why there's no particular outrage in the West, particularly America, particularly among black organizations, whose, if you're African American, there are Africans being sold in slave markets at the moment. Why is this not a huge thing? And I hate to say it, but I think it's probably true. There's no money in it. There's no economic advantage in it. There's no profit in it. The Muslim slave trade, as I've talked about repeatedly throughout history, has, killed about 100 million blacks or so. I mean, it's a massive, horrifying thing that happened. I don't see a lot of movement for guilt or reparations or anything like that. So there's that one aspect of it. And there's just no money in it. Like, you'd spend money, I guess, to go and publicize this and figure out how to solve it and save it and so on. But there's no affirmative action in it. There's no set-asides. There's no free federal money for minority-owned businesses. There's no particular money in it. And that is both liberating and extraordinarily enraging. It liberates me from any sense of white guilt. And I didn't really have a lot, but, any vestiges, gone. Because do you really care about slavery? I mean, slavery 150 years ago, if you can keep pounding that white guilt button, you can keep getting the vending machine of white guilt to cough up infinite resources. But if you really care about slavery, you would care a lot more about real live happening right now slavery in Libya than you would about slavery that close to 1 million, mostly white lives were spent in the elimination of 150 years ago. You would care about slavery now. I mean, if you were really horrified about the bubonic plague and the Black Death that occurred in early to mid-medieval Europe, then you would really care about a new outbreak, I would assume, of the bubonic plague, of the Black Death. That would be, I guess, number one on your list if you really cared about it. So it's a horrifying thing. So if it's true that the reason why there's not massive popular outrage about the reemergence of slavery in Libya is either or both, because it's Muslims, not whites, who are running the slave trade, and because there's just no money in it. There's no profit in it. There's no big white guilt button that you can keep pounding to get your resources. Now, if that's the case, then slavery has been used as an emotional and moral, legal and political weapon against whites, not because slavery is considered to be immoral, but because it's profitable. In other words, slavery has been used as a financial cudgel to morally beat resources out of guilty whites. And that is horrendous. Slavery, of course, a monstrous great evil. And whatever you think of white Western European Christian males, it was, in fact, white Western European Christian males who spent massive amounts of blood and treasure to end the worldwide practice of slavery that had existed in all cultures across all times throughout history. So, to use slavery, and I think this indicates that most people don't really care about slavery, because otherwise they'd be rousing for massive action about what's going on in Libya. They don't care about slavery, but they do care about getting resources. Now, if you use the historical wrong of slavery, not because you really care about it or think that it's wrong, but just in order to gain resources, you are really using people who were enslaved and their subjugation and the horror of their existence. You're using it to get resources. You're using it to guilt people into giving you money and power. I can't think of a worse thing to do. I mean, I might be able to tomorrow, but I sure as hell can't today.
In the crude mathematics of murder, communism must be reckoned the most lethal ideology ever devised by human intelligence. The transatlantic slave trade killed maybe 10 million people. The Nazis maybe murdered 17 million. Communism globally killed 100 million people. Some shot into pits, some arrested at night and taken off to gulags, some starved as state policy in order to enforce collectivization. So how is it, 100 years after the Bolshevik Revolution, that you still have people wearing Che Guevara t-shirts, saying that the idea of socialism wasn't so bad, it was messed up in the implementation, arguing even that it makes them morally superior? The idea that real socialism has never been tried is one of the more enduring myths in human discourse. But to see what's wrong with it, just try replacing the word socialist with the word fascist. Imagine somebody saying, well, we shouldn't judge fascism by the regimes in the 1930s that called themselves fascist. Real fascism as a textbook theory has never been tried. That would, of course, be a ridiculous position. We all see that fascism leads, in the end, to bloodshed, war, and oppression, and so has every single communist regime. Afghanistan, Bulgaria, Cuba, they all rely on torture, on firing squads, and on labor camps. 100 years on, it's time to recognize the evil for what it was.